left off last time with the revolutionary ideas that the Relational School has tried to introduce. And I just want to follow up a little bit more to give some structure to what I feel that they are saying that is relevant and new in terms of innovation. And then I'm going to turn to the postmodern critique of what many of, I think, the ideas that are being fleshed out within the last two decades have introduced to the field. It dawns on me to, first of all, say that we need to define what relationality is. And then we also need to define what postmodernism is. And, you know, like, this is frustrating because there's no consensus. So if you'll bear with me, I think I'll try to flesh out what, at least in my mind, is the key tenets of the relational model. And then we'll get into some very specific nuances of postmodern thought. So I hope you'll bear with me on this. So last time, I believe we left off this notion that relational theory is introducing a relational school. At one time, wanted to be just kind of called a tradition. Mitchell and Aaron's famous compilation of edited papers, before it really became a movement in itself. The notion that things that we would take for granted have been displaced. They've been reevaluated. So the notion of objectivity, the notion that psychoanalysis is a science, the notion of you know, the analytic authority over epistemological access to the client's mind. These things were all kind of being questioned and you know, brought up into a conversation that led to some, you know, really interesting critiques. So the notion that not only from a theoretical point of view, but from the notion of praxis. So think of the classical analyst as the person, maybe you have all had one, I sure did, where the notion of walking into the room where you have a very minimal greeting of acknowledgement of you as a person. There's not much that's being said, that you're gestured to come over and sit down or get onto the couch, and you do your free association thing, is entirely different with the relational, at least literature. And when I first started reading it and experiencing it, I thought, this is great. I mean, this is, you know, just absolutely wonderful. It's liberating. I don't want to be treated like an object. And that's my first analysis, unfortunately, was. So I gravitated toward the reading, to the literature. They are introducing the notion of a humanness, of an open type of relatedness as human beings that I was not accustomed to. Now, what that meant is a shift. It meant a shift from the intrapsychic to the interpersonal, or to what we call the relational now. And these analysts, these interpersonal analysts, were much more interested in the dialogical interaction that's taking place, in the meaning construction that's taking place between the two subjects in the office. So instead of focusing on the intrapsychic free associations and fantasies and reconstructed memories that the patients wanting to talk about their own developmental histories, etc., there seems to be much more of an open or permissive space to talk about the here and now, the two subjects in the room together. And it's not just simply about transference projections. So that's important. That, and this is to their credit. I mean, I don't even see how anybody could possibly think in today's day that everything is about the client or the patient projecting onto the analyst their behavioral fantasies and their conflicts in history, as if it's just an object. So that the whole blank screen stuff is untenable. Of course, you're responding to the individual in front of you. You've already acknowledged that they are a human being, that you're picking up on things, their their comportment, their personality, their facial expressions, their embodiment, the nonverbals, everything that is a two-way relation. Now the difference is I'm the one being analyzed. It's not necessarily the analyst who's open to being put on the couch too. But this is where the history of psychoanalysis is interesting to us, because it, some of these experimental techniques with the often marginalized, displaced, forgotten Freudian is Carl Jung. Jung started to experiment with mutual psychoanalysis before Ferenczi, by the way. So these types of techniques and types of mutual openness were experimental back in classical times, meaning classical psychoanalytic theory. So anyway, things are kind of, in some ways, reinventing the wheel, a revisiting of old approaches to analytic practice, but also at the same time within a contemporary framework. So these are all good things, interesting things. The Relational School introduces this embracing of this, we'll get to the details in a minute, this postmodern kind of way of looking at things. But before that, before the term even surfaced, they're interested in the phenomenology of lived experience. And with that comes the whole, early 20th century European philosophy that we call phenomenology. Yes, you've heard of it. It was introduced in many ways by Brentano, who was a professor of both Husserl and Freud. The notion, though, that looking at the phenomenology of the lived experience is, again, it's not a new concept. So, the relational kind of people are either rediscovering it or reappropriating it. But also, the existential tradition is very important here as well. So, and both movements simultaneously kind of developed at the same, at this period in history of philosophy. So this notion of turning to phenomenology is also moved into the hermeneutic tradition. So you have phenomenology, existential, and hermeneutical types of thinking. The notion of hermeneutics has to do with the theory of interpretation. So what is psychoanalysis classically? It's about interpreting things. It's about insight. It's about a critical analysis of patients' lives, but also of society. psychoanalysis is a philosophy of culture any more than it is a philosophy of mind. And it's important to keep that in mind given today's society. What we're seeing in contemporary, psychoanalytic circles is to start talking about things that were important to the critical theory or the Frankfurt School, where we're talking about structures of society, we're talking about power differentials or imbalances of power, we're talking about the culture industry, we're talking about things such as now, of course, it's coming to the fore again, but it's not like it's a new issue. The issue of diversity, of racial, gender inequalities, education, healthcare inequalities. We're looking at that now with the pandemic, and it's an exciting time, I think, for psychoanalysis as a vibrant intellectual discipline. So I think that the relational movement, the intersubjective relational movement, has revitalized discussions that were either tabled or not appropriately taken up historically. Maybe it needed to happen just through our contemporary times. But anyway, the notion is getting away from the focus on the interpsychic and the patient's life and their fantasies and their conflicts, and it's getting into mutual meaning construction. It's getting into the notion of our relationship that develops over time in the consulting room, and the emphasis is on that. Not only that, I mean, we talked about how last time, I believe, there was all this permissible space for talking about things that traditionally weren't allowed. At least they were considered taboo. That is, talking about your countertransference in the therapy, talking about disclosing things about your personal life to the patient, let alone self-revelations. And this, of course, is a sense of liberation, that you're just not talking to a robot or a machine or something, but you're talking to a human being, and they acknowledge their life, they acknowledge their issues, they're willing to dialogue about it, whereas the caricature of the classical analyst was the person who would not acknowledge, would not validate, would not respond to questions. And it's seen as your own resistance, it's seen as your own projection. When you're saying, well, why won't you answer my question? It's like you're acting like a withholding prick. It's like, no, you're just projecting your own aggression onto me, etc. Now, we've all gone, well, I'm not going to speak for you, but I have gone through this. And it was frustrating. It was extremely frustrating. So what do you do with that? You make the most of it, I suppose. I remember one time I said, listen, I didn't particularly like the way my third a senior who was trained by Winnicott, was trained by Masad Khan and by Anna Freud. And I said, can I call you Alan? No. We're going to keep it professional. And so he let me know the parameters. I said, okay, well, I'm going to get something out of this anyway then. I don't need to, foist my agenda about this. He set the stage. Now he was a relational Freudian. That's how I would put it. And it was good. I needed boundaries set. Instead of him interpreting, my need to put him down or to devalue him as a human being by wanting to call him his first name and having absolutely no relationship to him whatsoever, he did it in a way that was nice. It was respectful, and yet, again, how do people actually operate in the consulting room? I have no idea. We have just to go on our own intuition, our own experiences, our own reading, and how do we read the relational literature? So that's where I'm going to come from today. Let's back up a little bit. Relationality versus drive theory. So you have the relational, structural model that was being introduced by Greenberg and by Mitchell, and that was antithetical to a drive structural model. So why? They say in their 1983 book that the two models are incompatible, that really no integration is possible, that you've got the notion that you have a classical analytical theory where drives condition our urges, impulses, desires, that we are impelled to act out, we're impelled to project onto others, displace through our lives in various ways, and drive satisfactions are meant to fulfill certain wishes, ward off other types of conflicts we don't want to accept or admit or realize, and we're unconsciously defending against, etc. And that what's being offered as a replacement is that really life is about relationality. It's about forming relationship with people. This is what really the focus of analytic treatment should be about. Now, when you think about it, you think, well, is that really what I read or I learned? Well, I certainly learned that in graduate school. And then we get kind of told that, like these are competing theories and we have to choose. But in reality, that doesn't make any sense. What we do is we have competing agendas and we have competing perspectives, and we have different emphasis that we want to place on. So in reality, if I want to use that term, which is of course for homocentric thinking, is even completely up for grabs. But the notion that that it's either one or the other is a false dichotomy. I mean, who in their right mind is going to deny our embodiment? We are embodied people. We come from evolutionary currents that inform who we are, and so we have to accept that. And if somebody says, no, yeah, but the way you interpret embodiment is differently from a relational perspective, that's fine. That's okay. Let's just don't jettison, the baby in the bathwater here. That, and then you've got another competing agenda going on today. And this is the whole rave of neuroscience and cognitive science and, attachment in the right brain. Now, you'll get me going off on this too. See, as a critic, I criticize everybody equally. So I won't go into that now. But what we have is certain types of reductive ontologies that the relational movement takes objection to, and I agree with. Why would you want to boil everything down to a brain state? I mean, it's ridiculous. However, it's not to displace the notion that we have brains, that we have nervous systems, that we are embodied, and that the mind-body problem is a very important one, of course, of which we already know the conclusion. No one's figured it out yet. They can't even come to, meaning the philosophy of mind, people who specialize in this can't even come to an agreement about what consciousness is, let alone the unconscious. So when you have these big brains out there talking about the brain and no one is in agreement, I think we're among good company. I mean, psychoanalysis has a great deal to offer. The intelligentsia, the academy, and the public. So let me get off my tangent and back to this notion of the false dichotomy. So on one hand, let's say it's just the emphasis. They are introducing a new way of working theoretically and clinically in the consulting room, and there's been great advances because of that. Is it fair to displace traditional or classical thinking? No, it's not. And this is why you have backlash from, the tradition. So I don't want to get into that right now. I'll do that probably next time. But what is relationality? Let's start with that, and I'll move into, postmodern thought. So what are the key tenets of the relational model? Now, this is not easy to distill, and it's my, subjective interpretation, but at the same time, I think I'm trying to at least have a schemology or a typology so we can at least orient ourselves to what they're trying to offer. So what I think maybe approximate these key tenets are reasonably, they reasonably represent what many analysts' view of relationality represents to the field. So forgive me if other people want to argue about the nuances and fine details. But what does it represent to the field? Well, one would be the primacy of relatedness. So when Mitchell and Greenberg introduced this, they refer to the actually Greenberg in his book called Beyond Oedipus refers to the radical rejection of drive. And before that, Mitchell in his 1988 book on relational concepts simply displaced drive theory. So again, if we read this in a generous way, it's an attempt to resist reductionism. We don't want to just say everything boils down to the drive. So, good point. However, bad point is that you've displaced embodiment and our biological natures with a stroke of the pen. How could that happen? Why not and try to incorporate, our embodied drive, what the French school would call pulsional desire. And the pulsions, it's kind of, it's an interesting language. It tries to describe both the notion of desire and our embodied drive urges together. And if we get into Lacanian school, we can get off into all kinds of fun things. I'll try to resist myself. So the primacy of relatedness. Okay, makes sense. Relationships with others is, the basic stuff of mental life. And that does make a great deal of sense. I mean, we come into the world, but do we come into the world as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, or do we come in with our embodied existence, and then we have to relate to the external world? And of course, the external world is the world of maternal relatedness and paternal relatedness, or the otherness of society. These are, things that are important. but we privilege relationships over other things. In many ways, that's really nothing new. I mean, you know, for those who have studied Freud like I have, you know, Freud comes around in his theory. He wasn't particularly impressed with having to think and say the same thing all the time, and his views changed and altered. And by the end of his mature corpus, he says that our relationship with and our attachment, he uses these words, with our mother is the primary love object for all of the sexes, for both boys and girls. And it's a template that we are thrown into that in many ways is a beacon, if not conditioned, the way we relate to other people throughout our life. Very important notion that attachment theory was already prefigured into Freudian theory. But most people don't read that or know that. So, not to mention the fact that how do you separate out the self from others? I mean, you separate them out experientially, but how could you separate them out ontologically? I mean, our sense of self can never exist independent of our interpersonal environment, just like we can't exist independent of our community or our culture or society or language. It's all been imposed upon us, that we have been thrown into the world. And these things exist, they predate us. The difference here is that unconsciously we have a certain apparatus, to use a old-fashioned term, that we experience the world through. And some of the things that the relational theorists have written about seem to want to negate that. The second thing about the primacy of relatedness is that it hinges on the notion of what I call an intersubjective ontology. For those of you, I don't mean to insult, but for those of you that don't know the language of philosophy, ontology is basically the study of being or presence or what we say is real. So now you can see how when we introduce metaphysical concepts like that, how we experience reality, what is present to our minds, what is being, becomes radically questioned just from the standpoint of subjectivity. But that's not to say that the objective world doesn't exist. And unfortunately, some of the relational literature, you know, wants us to kind of question that. And we have to be, you know, vigilant of not to go down rabbit holes. But the notion of intersubjective processes is basically to privilege that relationship over, on one hand, subjectivity, which is the topic of you know, classical theory that's interested in the subjective mind of the patient. And the other side of the coin is objectivity. That means an object world exists out there independent of our minds, and it imposes itself on us. And then now what we do is we have a triangulation of intersubjectivity, like a new category where there's two subjects that are relating to one another. And the two subjects, analyst, patient, form a new relation or a new entity. Sometimes it's called the analytic third, things like this. The question becomes, does that displace the notion of what's objectively real? Well, the answer is no. But navigating between the subject, the object, and the intersubjective is something I think we all do. The way we come to conceptualize intersubjectivity is another issue. So in many ways, what is intersubjectivity is just simply a generic condition of interpersonal interactions and relationships with others. How is that any different than classical theory? I mean, no one would deny the fact that there's subjects that are relating to one another, talking with one another, interacting. It's just a matter of emphasis. Now, there's two different views well, there's probably tons of many, but what I focus upon is you have a developmental view of intersubjectivity. And the developmental view is different from, let's say, a systems view. So what goes on intersubjectively is could start from infancy, onward with the attachment system, with child development, etc., and how the maternal, paternal environment is internalized and comes to, become part of the interpersonal world of the infant. The systems view is talking about how an overarching field theory develops. So the overarching notion of the analytic relationship, and it takes on its own life. So I see kind of two different ways of looking, two major branches of looking at intersubjectivity theory. Now, of course, they're interdependent, they're intertwining, and that's what these interdependent subjectivities give rise to the field, or the world, or the third, or the horizons of possibility. All these are words that come from philosophy. They're really nothing new. Maybe with the third is a new one. But, Husserl talks about, the horizon, phenomenon. And I mean, the notion of fields, of systems, I mean, these are things that are not original. It's just reappropriated, and which would be fine. I mean, as long as, we acknowledge that. I'll critique the third in a little bit. We'll save that for later. However, the issue when you say everything's intersubjective, well, it makes that the ground and the locus, or the foundation of all experience. Now, is that the case? We have to ask that. Does that mean, and I'll get into some nuances in a bit, but that's an important thing, very important from a philosophical point of view, that they're differentiating classical theory by saying everything's intersubjective, it's the foundation of all experience, and then that means that things like our embodied drives, I use the term drive, Trieb, in German, because it's not the same as instinct. Instinct is a poor translation. Now, of course, instinct seems like it's instinctual, it's innate, it's within us. That's fine. That's where I think they're coming from with the word. But actually, Freud didn't use that. Trieb is an urge. It's a compulsion. It's got a impetus to it. It's embodied impetus. It's energy. It's a sense of a life principle, the notion of animus, animation. This is all comes from Greek philosophy. It comes from Plato and Aristotle in particular. The notion of the soul, the psyche, is the animator. This is what Aristotle referred to. The animator is what gives life. Well, we breathe, we feel it in us. And those are extremely important ways of describing our inner existence. So, again, it's not to, it's not to displace all that. It's just how do you take these concepts and reappropriate them within a relational point of view. Now, when you have the primacy of relatedness and you have an intersubjective ontology where everything, all, psychic life is about, a relationship with others, it forms all of the experiences. Well, doesn't that displace the notion of the unconscious? If everything is based upon conscious experience, with conscious experience is this relational exchange, it goes on. Then what happened to the unconscious? Where did that go? I mean, my criticism is it got evacuated. It just got demoted. If not, it got displaced or it got packaged away somewhere. Now, to their credit, the Relational School is reinvigorating unconscious processes. They're bringing them back into a discourse. However, once you've already committed to the notion that everything is relational, you're challenging a philosophy of mind that says there are things that exist outside of the relationships with others. So what I would say is that you don't need to go that way. You don't need to overstate your case, and that you can explain how both processes are operative, maybe on parallel levels, but at least in tandem with one another, and that they cannot be ontologically separate. They are intertwined. They're operative in different ways and in different modalities. So what if more criticism about the displacing the notion of the unconscious is that, how do you make out of things such as like defense and fantasy formation and compromises and transference projections? If everything's intersubjective and relational, then where do those interpsychic wishes and conflicts and internal divides and complexes that people have, how could that exist by themselves? Well, they do. Now you could say, well, they've been interpersonally or relationally conditioned, and that's why you have the complexes and conflicts and symptoms to begin with. Okay, well, we can go down that route, but you still, in my mind, need to preserve that element of privacy, that uniqueness of the subjective mind of each person. And that's why nobody's the same. How could you ever meet someone and just assume they're the same? No, everybody's unique. They bring in their unique personalities and histories and conflicts and intentions and counterintentions and aspirations and everything. That's they may fit into a general scheme or pattern of the way we look at personality development or the structure of the self, etc. But they're not the same. Who have you met? Who? Any individual you ever met that you say they're identical? No. So again, it's a little bit overblown. Let's just say the early founders were attempting at a revolution theory. They had to fight some of these old conceptions or caricatures of what they were taught, and they want to emphasize a new way of thinking and a new way of relating therapeutically in the consulting room. Another tenet of the relational model, I think in many ways has to do with psychoanalytic hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, a theory of interpretation. It's concerned with how do we describe phenomenon. So this is a little complicated. Hopefully I don't get too distracted here. But in keeping with the literature, there seemed to be a focus on the notion of context. What's important here is the context or the contingencies that take place, and hence the way we interpret some aspects of people's lives have to take into consideration their contextual complexities. So, fine, makes sense to me. Even though it might lead us into like what we call a constructivist epistemology. Again, epistemology, for those who might not know the discipline, has to do with theories of knowledge. How do we know? So the relational movement actually did a wonderful job of trying to question our assumptions around analytic authority as having a superior access to knowledge that was being questioned. Why would we assume that the classical interpretation of my dream or my symptom or my Oedipus complex means that? As if it's some kind of objective phenomenon, or not even a phenomenon. It's real, and this is it. And that interpretation means this, and this is what your symptoms represent or symbolize, etc. The relational folk were wanting to say, why do you have such pretensions to know? You think that you can just make an interpretation and it's like from God's mouth, and that it's not merely an explanation either. It is it's a certification of truth, that this is what's going on in your head, and this is the real reason why you're doing this or this or this. Well, I am in quite agreement that the notion that to think that there's some kind of objectified truth to the universe or to my mind that exists out there, and we need to have the analysts tell us and illuminate us about these eternal truths, does sound a bit odd, at the very least. However, getting back to my critique is that doesn't necessarily mean there's no such thing as objective knowledge. So this is where I think, like Mitchell in particular, was starting to challenge that, why should we buy into this hogwash? And again, I think last time I brought up the notion that please don't look at theorists who are challenging the old guard as simply having an Oedipus acting out complex event. Just because somebody challenges other authorities or theories or systems of thinking doesn't mean that they're psychologically motivated because they're acting out against daddy, for instance. These are important things to critically think about. But again, one doesn't have to go the whole gamut where we displace the notion of objectivity in general, which is, I'm leading up to the discussion on postmodernism. What we see in the literature are things like having, that meaning is constructed. Or there's a critical, or meaning the interplay of oppositions, and that we co-construct meaning, meaning the therapist and the patient. They both are engaged in a mutual process of trying to illuminate the lived experience. And that means that we have a falliblistic epistemology, that we can't claim that we know, that we might be mistaken. We might be horribly wrong, in fact. And if any of you have ever had these searing interpretations by your analyst or by your teachers that this means that, and it leaves an aftermath of whatever shame or wanting to act out because you're enraged that you're being told something that in your mind it just couldn't possibly be, and that you feel like you've been subjected to some hegemony who wants to dominate and control you and get some sadistic, perverse pleasure out of, imparting these interpretations. Of course, it's not my projection. Yeah, you know what I mean. So with that also comes the introduction of a postmodern sensibility. Now, what's postmodernism mean? We can't even on that. I'll let you know what I think after reading a lot. But on one hand, we'd want to emphasize the notion of perspectivalism. It's from your perspective, meaning subjectively, this is how you experience or construe your reality. So fair enough. And this goes back, at least to Nietzsche, where, the notion of questioning the structures of reality. But, people like Donna Orange have picked up on the notion of perspectivalism or perspectival theory of truth and things like this. I'm leading up to this because what is truth is another issue. Let's stay focused on the fact that this is where the patient's lived life, lived subjective life is about. This is their perspective. This is the way they are experiencing the world, and that's good. Now, the postmodern sensibility, though, is also shifting the sands. And it's shifting the sands to focus on the notion of language. It's focusing on the notion of signs and significations, or what we call semiotics. And it's talking about bigger things, but they're vague, like construction. Well, what's that mean? Everything's a social construction. That's Foucault. So that this whole shifting into talking about how language structures reality, our internal reality, they're important discussions to have. However, they can lead into a lot of conundrums. And I guess it's important for us to sift through what makes sense to us and what we should, take away as important versus the implications of what these theories that are being introduced in psychoanalysis are about. So now what I would say currently in the relational tradition, that's now a movement. It's an international movement that, for those of you that didn't attend last week, have seen more people joining this perspective on all of the inhabitable continents that we live on, and it's for a reason. So the notion, though, of this postmodern term is in many ways like thinking about the nature of meaning, of construction, of interpretation, of questioning these greater things such as, absolutes, universals, certainty, truth, objectivity, that it's being presented as a challenge against these traditional metaphysical categories. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that it's a reaction to modern, the main tenets of modern philosophy and modern science. So because we can't even find a consensus around what postmodernism means, let me just try to give you my take. Whether it's debatable whether you agree or not. I'm just trying to sketch out something for us to discuss. I think you can describe postmodern thought more in terms of negation than you can affirmation. So it's more about what it's not. It's like through the via negativa. So we know something based more on what it's not. And so it is a response to the notion of, modern principles and modern science that wants to say there is objectivity. There is an object world that we can study, that we can observe, that we can measure, and we can calculate. And we discover certain types of universal truths or laws, and hence that's why we have the discipline of physics and mathematics. But the postmodern turn wants to focus on the nature of language and how language actually determines these things that we say are objective. So it's kind of interesting take, and it depends upon who you read that you could say, well, that makes sense, and other things you're going to say that doesn't make sense. From both camps, believe me. There was a big brouhaha that happened a couple decades ago where there was a physicist named Stokely, and he wrote a paper that was published in a postmodern journal on how all of physics is simply a social construction. And so these, I don't know, I guess these literary critics or, English PhD people, philosophy, humanities people published this thing, and it became a raving joke. It's like, here, anything's a social construction, such as the laws of physics. I just say it's this. And, they made a joke of it. like he says, if you think the laws of physics are simply made up in your mind as a linguistic construction, then try flying off the roof of my condo. I'm on the 24th floor, you know, so it led for really good entertainment. But the point is, how far do you go? Now, I can be equally critical of science and scientific claims and the ideologies of science, which I've written about. But at the same time, there are certain things that would just be ludicrous to try to negate. Let's try to be favorable about what the postmodern people are attempting to do. On one hand, it's kind of like this pluralistic mosaic of views. Depends who you read, depends upon what discipline you're reading in, but they're really quite disparate from each other. The notion of, again, of social construction with Foucault, in France, and the notion everything is language, was also predated by poststructuralism and again the linguistic turn in philosophy. Now that took place simultaneously with let me back up real briefly. You've got the linguistic turn, but it takes place in two disciplines. It takes place in analytical philosophy and continental philosophy. In analytical philosophy, we're talking about Anglo-American, people from mainly England who are interested in logic, mathematics, precision. And that is a camp that's in many ways opposed to continental thinking. And so you have Willard Quine, who introduces postmodern thinking in analytic, logical circles. And at the same time, you have Derrida, who introduced, maybe a little bit later, but he introduces the notion of deconstructionism. And how do we deconstruct language? And how do we deconstruct the meaning of meanings and words? And so they're both going on simultaneously, of course, outside of our discipline of psychoanalysis. And that's why you have radically different ways of understanding things, but at the same time, they're talking about the importance of language. So you also have the post-structural movement, like post-Saussure, where things like meaning is a word means something, and this is a fixed meaning. And then you have that people say, no. Words, meanings, definitions, they're malleable. And so in psychoanalysis, the closest to post-structural, postmodern thought is Lacan and Lacanian discourse and that whole discipline. So the other part of that distinction between deconstruction is the focus on the narrative. And so what we're interested in is looking at the text and what the text and the narrative tells us. And we are trying to look for inconsistencies and things that contradict one another. And however, this shows, whether it be analytical or continental thinking, that meaning is unstable. That a word doesn't just mean one thing. We say, oh, this means that. No, it has a whole It has a whole etymology. It has a whole relation to other meanings, and that you have an infinite deferral of a chain of significations going back and back and back to the point where you can't discern the meaning of this word now, because it has so many iterations. And so the thought that meaning is static, is fixed, is stable, is to be displaced with the postmodern turn. So in many ways it makes sense. If anyone is looked at etymologies and how word origins derive, that you could, this word derived from this, from this, from this, from this. They have these offshoots, and now what it means now is that there's multiple meaning within the signification of the trace or the sign or the semiotic. And it's very fascinating stuff. And I've become more appreciative of reading this literature, because you can see that, yeah, I mean, things aren't necessarily fixed. Meaning, is very, very fluid. However, with the language of science, you have to have operational definitions. You have to have agreements and consensus about what these things mean. And that's when you can have a meaningful or intelligent discussion or conversation. If you can't agree upon the premises of something, how are you going to be able to relate? So maybe these are all social conventions. However, do we look at language as a tool for understanding, for communication? Or do we look at language as what basically causes us to think and feel and act, are contentious issues? You can go down other, avenues of critique, but let's just say, for argument's sake, that we have to use language in everything. We try to communicate our internal experience or live meaning, and this is what led to people like the logical positivists, which was popular in the 30s, 40s, Vienna, Austria, where we're not gonna talk about anything unless we can agree upon certain definitions that are meaningful and that have a logical analysis, because things that we can't agree upon, we just really can't have any kind of meaningful discussion about. So what's the point? And what that did was it displaced the notion of metaphysics. It displaced the notion of anything that's not empirical. So good, what that means is religion out the window. Anything that is not tangible, that anything that is supernatural, immaterial, is off limits, it's illegitimate, it's used as a way of negating other beliefs. But it also is, overly cognitive, overly logocentric, to the degree that it invalidates other modes of knowing or other forms of knowledge, like intuition and affect and somatic resonance, things that people would say isn't legitimate. But we all we all have different ways of relating and experiencing the world, and we feel it in our bodies, and there might be intuitions and hunches and things that we go on, and there are other forms of meaning that are operating, and particularly from the unconscious, like the symbolic life, how important that is. So these are some of the criticisms of saying everything is linguistic. However, the problem with when we adopt these, what I refer to as pomo-centric notions, that they could lead down rabbit holes. And some of the relational literature has bought it hook, line, and sinker. So if everything's language, you have a causal connection where the outside is always superimposed on you. The environment, our cultural and linguistic processes, this is the new causality. Instead of being, it's all internal, it's all impulses, it's drives, it's biology. Now we have the swing. It's all cultural. It's all outside of the subject that's imported on us. And this is Lacanian move. You have the biological determinism of classical analysis on one hand, where it's criticized. You have the environmental determinism of, linguistic theory on the other. When in reality, they're cooperative. They are coextensive. They are interacting. We don't need to go to these extreme bifurcations. And I think people do this as a way of getting attention. You over exaggerate a polarity, and that's what the relational early school did. They got a great deal of attention by overstating themselves. Now they're established. They need to backtrack. You don't need to be so radical now, so revolutionary. You need to look at the mistakes you've made. You need to improve. You need to innovate, and no need to, devalue our ancestry here. We need to take it up and incorporate it and modernize it in some way. I don't see the incompatibilities that Mitchell and Greenberg talked about, that you have to choose sides. There's no integration. That's makes no sense to me. I mean, you have a very comprehensive philosophy of mind. We have to take up the notion of our embodiment and take up the notion of our relational orientation to the world, and at the same time that we have to appreciate the fact that we have our own subjective, internal, private lives and fantasy worlds that structure our relation to society and the universe. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to pick one side or the other, but we have to be much more open to how do we fit it all together. But the trouble with the going too far to the left of the pomocentrism is that what happens to the self? Well, the notion of selfhood, or the separateness of the self, the notion of an enduring personal identity, the notion of agency, of freedom, it gets displaced. It gets displaced for the intersubjective system. So when I'm thinking about it, I couldn't help, I got a new book. It's actually a second edition. Here's what Stollerow says. He says, quote, "In place of the Freudian unconscious, a sealed off underground chamber of the Cartesian isolated mind, we envision a multiply contextualized experiential world, an organized totality of lived personal experience, more or less conscious. More or less conscious. Where did the unconscious go? Now, not only that, the premise of, he starts out with, in place of the Freudian unconscious. We get a lovely setup here. Like, this is the straw man argument. I mean, we just need to set up people, tear them down, after we misrepresented what they really mean or said, a sealed off underground chamber of the Cartesian isolated mind. Does the unconscious really operate that way? It's a sealed off container. No, at least my unconscious, it's permeable. It announces itself sometimes in a very autonomous fashion. It lets its presence known. It's not sealed off, not to mention an isolated mind. I don't have an isolated mind. I'm relating to people in my mind all the goddamn time, whether it be good or bad. So, no, I've internalized my world, but I still have a private relationship with my internal objects. Now, not to mention that the way he interprets Descartes is completely fallacious. Descartes did not say there's any isolated mind. If anyone read, he never read Descartes. He read, introductory textbooks. That if you read Descartes' Meditations, he specifically states how the mind, the res instantia and the cogito are a unit. They form a unit. So the external world, the world of space, of our embodied time, of objects, is not separate from our relation to it. So it's a unit. And the cogito doesn't exist. How could you have the mind, the self, that is a monad? Now, Mitchell uses those terms too, like from Leibniz. That's the term from Leibniz, monad. All there is this internal little world, separate, segregated from others. But that's just not the way it is. So I hope to convince you, maybe it won't persuade you, but convince you to think more openly when you read these things, that some of our learned colleagues are taking liberty with certain concepts in our history to promote a certain agenda or a certain way of thinking that maybe is not fair, but nevertheless it does achieve its objective. That I cannot tell you how irritated I am every time I see something like this post-Cartesian psychoanalysis, as if he's reinventing the wheel here, as if it's something new, like the term intersubjective is nothing new, nothing. So it's, sorry for my rant, but this is the passion that we have about these things. So getting back to the postmodern issues, is that this kind of movement is to challenge this notion of absolutes. There's no such thing as an absolute. There's no such thing as truth and reality. There's no such thing as absolute knowledge or certainty. They are anti-metaphysical by definition. And I guess, what do you say about that? I mean, maybe this is simply the implications of postmodern thinking, that you have things like the end of metaphysics. Well, how could there be the end of metaphysics? I mean, metaphysics means different things. You have historically, actually, metaphysics was labeled because it followed Aristotle's book on physics. After physics, that's the way we got the word. That people who discovered his works relabeled it. This was the book that came after the physics. We call it metaphysics. However, metaphysics means all kinds of things today. It means things that are big first principles, such as the nature of the universe, the cosmos, first cause, what's causality, the question of God, all these really interesting, fun things to discuss. How could that be displaced by everything's language? Or because we can't have a meaningful agreement about what this constitutes, we're not really going to have any discussion about it whatsoever. It's meaningless. This is like the non-cognitivists talk about. But anyway, there's no such thing as a universal. I mean, what do you mean? You mean there's no such thing as the unconscious? Does the unconscious exist in every single human being that exists on the planet today, or does it not? Every human being has unconscious processes. They are just different, or they're contextualized differently, they are expressed differently, they might vary from culture to culture, from gender to gender, etc. You still have a universal, hence an absolute, in the sense that it absolutely must exist or you don't have anything. And this is another element, is to negate the notion of essence. There's no such thing as essentialism. You'll see this in the writing, against essentialism. And I say, well, what do you mean by that? Essence, the essence of something. What Aristotle talked about is that in order for something to exist, it must have essential properties. And if it doesn't, that means it doesn't exist. So people get hung up on these words. And one of the bad press on essentialism is that they think that everything is fixed, like a fixed static property that inheres in an object. Well, maybe that's medieval philosophy. But there's so many different movements in philosophy, but with German idealism, it goes back to Heraclitus, the notion of process. So you have an ancient philosophy that was picked up with German idealism in particular, and then brought into the 20th century with, so from, let's say, Heraclitus to Hegel to Whitehead, that reality is process. And everything is processual. So this would not negate the relational school. They don't need to go down that road. Of course, everything's about process. In fact, for Hegel, essence must appear in order for anything to be actual. So it's a very important point that, let's say in psychoanalytic terms, a dream, a symptom, a slip of the tongue, that is the manifestation of unconscious process. It has to appear, but it appears in disguised forms or in transformational modes. Of course, it's up to us to try to find meaning in it, and etc. But again, anti-essentialistic thinking is, again, in my point of view, it seems to be like a reactionary defense against not liking something. Now, one of the reasons for it is that with postmodern thought comes all kinds of new philosophical movements, or even in sociology. So, feminism, narrative literary criticism, deconstruction. You've got certain groups that have historically been marginalized, prejudiced against, discriminated against. So the diversity focus we see today, the notion of difference, the notion of race, LGBTQ. Now it's questioning, not just queer, but questioning queer, two spirits, androgynous, and what's the last one? Probably asexual, let's say. Those are groups that have important voices that have been stifled, and they want to be heard, which makes sense. They would gravitate toward this postmodern literature. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it deflates or debunks or displaces these greater, metaphysical concepts, let alone how they materially, manifest. So all I'm saying is that we need to be open to these ideas, and one doesn't necessarily have to negate the other, and we need to be more encompassing. The issue, I'm mindful. 5 more minutes, and I'm going to open it up for talking. And I never get through anything I want to do. Sorry. If language is a necessary condition of subjectivity, which it is, it doesn't mean it's a sufficient one. Just because something's necessary, just like our bodies, doesn't mean it's sufficient to explain things. Like, what happens to stuff like pre-verbal development? If everything's language, we have pre-verbal life, we have an affective life, and a somatic life that predates developmentally an infant's capacity to articulate through speech. We have a symbolic life that concepts alone cannot really, come close to expressing what the meaning imbued in symbols are. They are overdetermined. And that's why there's a mysteriousness to images. There's multiple meanings that are inflected into them through our minds. You might have somebody who says, this is what this means symbolically about this image, but the way you interpret it, the way you experience it, the way you have subsumed it in your own subjectivity, you're going to interpret it and have a different feel from what someone else tells you this should mean. So just like art, our aesthetic sensibilities, how can all of that just be boiled down to language? And things that are just extra linguistic, they're more than that. These are things that I think we need to keep in mind when you want to, just adopt a postmodern thought. And at the same time, it's in response to, again, this notion of positivist science. Now that word positivism, it's a loaded word. It's like if somebody says, oh, that's positivist. Well, yeah, do you know what that means? I didn't know what positivism meant. I know what logical positivism was, but I didn't know what positivism was. But it seems to be just a red herring for I don't like science. when science is telling you that there's something positive to gain from its applications. And so we need to lessen the gauntlet that's being thrown out, or the bifurcations, and if we do that respectfully, I would imagine we're going to have a much more vibrant discipline where all sides have a voice. We don't need, just like the clinicians like to say, we don't like empirical science. All that matters to me is this or my theories, and I don't want to be open to others. Well, that's a closed off way of looking at the world. You might disagree, but I'd like to at least know what my critics have to think before I criticize them. So with that, I'll open it up to discussion.
John, you covered an amazing amount of territory in actually a relatively short amount of time. You talked about postmodernism, talked about the relational turn, ontology, subjectivity, objectivity, language, the developmental point of view, the systemic point of view, and you built I can't think of the word, but you constructed an edifice that essentially we could live in, and you left room for other constructions that could be added on. And I'd like the fact that you didn't just say, this is it, this is the way it is. And as you were talking about postmodernism, I had this horrible thought that if we wanted to prove the case, and I hope we never do, we could fly up to Toronto and shoot you dead, and you would be dead. And in fact, that would be a fact.
That's right.
Despite,
we're glad you restrained your aggression, Bert.
Right. or you could fly down to here, to me. Dead is dead, live is live. There are some objective points of view, aggressive or not.
Yeah. Well, thanks.
Dr. Mills,
yeah.
I just want to thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think you point out what really strikes me is this sort of swing, the sort of polarity, and I don't know. It begs the question: what is it that makes that happen in human nature, where we get to this point where we're in such binary ways of thinking? And what can help us be in better conversation? Because I think it seems like being in the middle and more inclusive in terms of what we bring to our conversation is what's needed.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you, Lee. Please call me John, by the way, everybody. I think that's a really good question, because why did that happen? I suppose it's a psychological question about motivations too. My guess is that it's based upon politics, and or the politics of desire, and you have, if you have historically the relational movement developed based upon two young psychologists at the William Allison White Institute that were trained in interpersonal tradition, and that already had a history of wanting to challenge classical psychoanalytic training. And so, and that hegemony, particularly in American psychoanalytic institutes, that wasn't the same in Europe. It wasn't until Brill, established this bifurcation or club. And so I could imagine, our colleagues, young colleagues, getting energized by wanting to challenge some of the traditions that they were being taught. However, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't, for ourselves, critique people's theories. I find that very important to learn from. And yeah, how do we get to here? Is not replicating the same thing that has been done, and that is to have a monopoly on thought, on theory, and saying this is the way things should be done. The American is, horribly horrible oligarchy. I mean, it's all about certain people keeping the status quo, strictures around training. Remember, they had to sue the American and the international. So these power differentials don't like to give things up, but we're in a different reality now. I mean, traditional psychoanalysis is probably in America is going to be dead. It's going to be more psychotherapy, psychoanalytic psychotherapy, because people can't afford it. Actually, I have a paper coming out on crisis and ideology and psychoanalysis where I talk about it. But anyway, I don't want to blab on and on, but good point that you made. Susan.
I have I'm sorry.
Linda? Yeah.
Yeah. Not so, you were, question was coming up, for you, in terms, like philosophically, and using language and what's truth and what's not truth, what's an objective reality, subjective, what is reality? So, I think, for analysts and psychoanalytic therapists, we often see patients presenting who might be, patients who present a lot of distortions. Well, here we're getting into what's real and what's not real. But when we start to see things that are clearly based on our own experience of the patient and based on what the patient is telling us, we know that there are distortions and embellishments or exaggerations. And I think, I think we all know, it's not a matter of what's the truth or what's not the truth. It's always going to be somewhere in the middle of what empirically happened, whether it's way in the past or even the more recent situations, more current situations for a patient, let's say a patient who's getting into fights at work with the boss. I think we have to accept, what the patient's reality is, what his emotional reality is, that for him is the empirical truth at that moment. That's what he's experiencing. Anyway, that's kind of how I will always work in terms of my mindset. Not that I'm eliminating what I think might be going on in the real world, that the patient might be distorting or be having having conflicts that are leading him to his position, but essentially, yeah, I think when we start to think of what the truth is, objective or subjective, I think it does get very philosophical, which is, and then we say, you know, is this a field that's based on science? I don't know if we're all that scientific that we have to have such an empirical truth in this field. I think there's a certain art or a certain kind of empathy that we develop in terms of how we see people and understand, you know, the human predicament. So that's just some thoughts that I have.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up, I think the fundamental difficulty we have is when, you know, patients, I mean, there's two things. There's the here and now versus the then and there. And when people are like retrieving memories, we kind of, as you suggest, we can't help but think that they've been filtered through reconstructions, reappropriations, embellishments, that we can't really discern what was empirically the facts from what somebody experientially feels is their psychic reality. And I agree with you that we have to kind of sit with that ambiguity versus and then go with it. That's what's real for you. That's your psychic reality right now. But when we see it in the context of distortions, and we can hear their, either we hear them, we intuit them, we see the inconsistencies, the gaps, the contradictions. All we can do is kind of highlight those and see where it takes us. But we don't have any capacity to confirm or verify or replicate what's happened. We have to navigate that ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm in agreement. Like, no, I don't look at myself as a scientist in the consulting room, but I am listening for, you know, when someone says, I remember when I was 6 months old in my crib, and neuroscience says, well, that's impossible because the neural nets couldn't even be laid in the brain down at that time. And that seems like to be after effects or après coup or reconstruction about what you imagine you were like as a baby in the crib. I mean, we have to kind of weigh those things out. Whether we bring them into into dialogue with the patient is another issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Susan.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you for your talk tonight, and I really marvel at your intellect, your passion, your knowledge, extensive knowledge, and I think we were all very well informed tonight. How you brought you made the binary, you integrated it, and I was a little hesitant to come on tonight because in the last years I've caught into the relational theory. I heard that this was a conversation about, opposition to, and I was a little, resistant, but I curiously did come on, and I appreciate your really highlighting how we must continue to include Freud. As a matter of fact, Lou Aaron, may his soul rest in peace, always held on to Freud's theories till the end and included his thinking in all of his articles. And I like the way you combined the two. And I hope our institute will continue to inform us on both and integrate the two together.
Well, thanks for your flattery. We'll get you everywhere.
I'm a fellow Canadian, so I like your accent, and
that's true.
I feel at home with you.
Thank you.
It's true.
By the way, I want to add something that I really meant to do before I went off on my a tangent. a colleague of mine, Francois Devoyne, talked about Descartes, and she enlightened me to what Descartes really said in the French. And it's quite different from what Descartes' followers, who we have been following, thinking they represented the accurate Descartes. It's quite different from what they characterized what he said rather than what he actually said. And when she put it into the context of his times, we now can recognize that he, and he said this in his own words, always looked over his shoulders in case there was somebody following him in the shadows. That's practically a quote. What was the shadows that he needed to stay out of the limelight? It was the Inquisition. And so he doctored some of the things that he said. And those were misquotes that got carried on largely because people didn't want to die or get tortured before they died.
Right.
And so the mind-body notion, duality, was not his at all.
That's interesting, Bert. That is, yeah. I've heard from a number of Descartes scholars different stories that he was a closet atheist and he had to be really careful with the church, and so yeah, that makes a lot of sense what he said. Yeah. Candace, were you going to say something?
Oh yeah, I was wondering, going back to that sticking to one point of view, I wonder to some extent, aren't you reflecting on really the immature collective mind, how it still has trouble containing opposite things in the same field, and tends to cling to one polarity and dismiss the other as a result. It's pre-Oedipal thinking. And until people as a collective or the individual, the personality disorders we see in our offices are able to manage conflict, to handle the two opposing things within the same field of observation, we're going to be in trouble.
You know, you got a paper you can write on that. Yeah, it's
I think other people have.
the notion of splitting. We can't help it. In many ways, it's it's a basic process of thinking. It's to divide.
This is the primal repression that Freud talked about. It's essentially dissociation. What we don't want to deal with, we simply split off from our consciousness, to use that word. And this is the way we handle our thinking until we learn to have a mind that can encompass opposites, was capable of handling conflict, and then may rather enjoy, as the French do definitely, if not the English, may enjoy arguing about stuff.
Absolutely. Good point.
Okay. If there's nobody else, I think this may be a good time to end. Our next session with Jon will be March the 24th. So mark that on your calendars if you haven't done that already. March the 24th, and I'm looking forward to that, Jon, tremendously.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see you.